Picture this, it's early 1976, Deep Purple, one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, is completely falling apart. The drug abuse is out of control, the internal politics are poisonous, and right in the middle of all that chaos is a guy from a small town in the north of England named David Coverdale, who landed the gig of a lifetime just a few years earlier and was now watching it disintegrate in real time. By March of 1976, he's done. He hands in his resignation and walks away. So what do you do when you've been the frontman of one of the loudest, most bombastic rock bands ever assembled, and then suddenly it's just over? That's exactly what we're getting into today. Coverdale didn't exactly ride off into the sunset with his head held high. The final months of Deep Purple Mark IV had been brutal. The substance abuse was rampant, the creative well was dry, and by the time the curtain came down, he was genuinely exhausted. So his first move wasn't to storm into a studio and launch a grand solo career. It was to go crash at his mom's pub in London and just decompress. He reportedly sat down and wrote an extensive resignation letter to the band's management, which honestly is a very Coverdale move. Very formal, very considered. And then, once that was done, he started thinking about what came next. The problem was, staying in England wasn't going to be easy. The British music press was absolutely brutal in those days, and on top of that, Deep Purple's breakup had created a complicated web of legal and tax issues for everyone involved. So Coverdale made a somewhat unexpected decision. He packed up and moved to Munich, West Germany, where he was living with his then wife, Julia. And here's where things start to get interesting. Away from the noise of the London scene, Coverdale started writing again, and crucially, he started writing with a guitarist named Micky Moody, a friend he known from his pre-Deep Purple days, long before any of the stadium rock stuff happened. The two of them clicked immediately, and what came out of those early sessions had almost nothing to do with what you'd expect from a former Deep Purple vocalist. Instead of going heavier, Coverdale went the other direction entirely. He wanted blues, he wanted funk, he wanted soul and R&B, the music he grew up loving, before hard rock stardom had pulled him away from those roots. And Moody, with his exquisite slide guitar playing, was exactly the right person to help him get there. By the summer of 1976, we're talking just a few months after leaving Deep Purple, Coverdale was ready to record. Sessions split between Kingsway Recorders in London and Musicland Studios in Munich. And for the producer's chair, Coverdale turned to someone he trusted, Roger Glover. Now this is a fun one. Glover and Coverdale are both famous for their time in Deep Purple, but they actually never played in the band at the same time. Glover had left before Coverdale arrived, but they knew each other, they liked each other, and Glover had already established himself as a solid in-house producer for Purple Records. Coverdale felt that Glover genuinely understood what he was trying to do and could help carry the creative load during what was, by all accounts, a pretty daunting transition. Coverdale later said Glover made the whole process much easier with his encouragement and positive attitude. And Glover didn't just sit behind the board either. He played synthesizer, jumped on bass guitar alongside session players, and threw himself into the album completely. The session musicians Glover assembled were something else. They weren't heavy metal guys, they were jazz cats, funk players, and soul veterans, which was exactly the point. On drums, Glover brought in a 19-year-old boy. He was a prodigy named Simon Phillips. He was only 19, and the kid was already being personally scouted by Glover, and within a few years, he'd been working with Jeff Beck in The Who, so the guy was a real talent. Tim Hinckley handled keyboards and organ, bringing a warm, gospel-tinged sound from his years working with acts like Humble Pie and Al Stewart. The Elise Lee Harper, a Caribbean-born funk and fusion bassist, shared the low end with Glover, and his bouncy rhythmic style was about as far from John Lord's Hammond-driven thunder as you can possibly get. Ron Asbury came in to overlay saxophone and flute arrangements, adding genuine jazz rock sophistication, and for backing vocals, Glover pulled in Barry St. John, Liza Strike, and Helen Chappell, singers who are contributing harmonies to records like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and early Elton John albums. This was not a hard rock band, this was a soul review, and that was completely intentional. The album that came out of all this, simply titled Whitesnake, 2 words, released in February 1977, is a fascinating document that doesn't get nearly enough attention. It opens with Lady. Right from the jump, you know you're not in Kansas anymore. Micky Moody's slide guitar is front and center, the brass section is punching in, and the Angels of Mercy are stacking harmonies behind Coverdale's voice. It's warm and soulful and immediately signals that whatever this record is, it's not burned. To his Blind Man, and I genuinely think this might be one of the best things Coverdale ever recorded. It's moody, atmospheric, a slow-burning blues showcase that lets his voice do things he never really got to do in Deep Purple. He loved it so much he eventually re-recorded it for Whitesnake's 1980 album, Ready and Willing, and that tells you everything. Goldie's Place follows with a lazy, strutting funk groove. Critics compare it to Steely Dan, which is not a comparison you'd ever make about Deep Purple. And then comes a track that changes everything, Whitesnake. Harder edge than the rest, built around Simon Phillips' crisp drumming and Glover's subtle synth textures. And of course, it's a song that gives a future band its name. Side 2 opens with Time on My Side, co-written with Moody, sitting in that Joe Cocker and Frankie Miller territory, bluesy soul rock that just settles in the groove and stays there. Peace, Love, and Man is more vulnerable and reflective, almost gospel in its atmosphere, with the choir adding a real emotional weight. Sunny Days lightens the mood with a breezy, acoustic leaning feel, a little breathing room before the close. Hole in the Sky is a piano-led ballad at the heart of side 2, and it was actually released as the album's lead single. It didn't chart at the time, which is criminal. It's a stunning vocal performance and shows a side of Coverdale's range that the Purple years rarely had room for. And then the whole thing closes out with Celebration. A horn-heavy call and response funk party that sends you out the door grinning, a joyful ending to what had been, for Coverdale personally, a pretty turbulent year. The album didn't make a huge commercial splash, but it mattered enormously in a different way. It proved that Coverdale could operate outside the Deep Purple machine on his own terms. It found new musicians, especially Micky Moody, who would eventually form the core of a real band, and it planted the seed of a name, of an identity that would, within just a few years, become one of the biggest acts in rock music. The follow-up came quickly. Barely a year later, Coverdale was back in the studio for album number 2, North Winds, where the blueprint started to harden into something harder, more focused, and unmistakably closer to the Whitesnake sound that fans would eventually go absolutely crazy for, and that will be my next video. But for now, take a moment, go back to Whitesnake, give it a proper listen, because it's a genuinely great record from someone who had every reason to doubt himself. Going back to basics, coming out the other side was something really special. Check out this playlist of Deep Purple album reviews. I'm doing the entire story of Deep Purple from the beginning, and I'm doing all side projects, including Whitesnake, the Ian Gillan Band, Rainbow, and I'll probably branch out into more bands just till I get to the end. And thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and all that. See you in the next one.